A February 5th, 1963 memorandum entitled, quote, Establishment of Executive Committee for Air Proprietary Operations, end quote, noted that the committee was, quote, to provide general policy guidance for the management of air proprietary projects and review and final recommendations for approval of air proprietary project actions, end quote. Houston indicated that this committee, dubbed XCOM Air, was, quote, was an amorphous group, end quote, which worked on a very informal basis. He indicated that XCOM Air was an effective method of achieving overall coordination. It was responsible for conducting a thorough inventory of all of the equipment that the agency had in the aviation field and was generally able to keep track of who needed what. Footnote 50. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 50. IBID page 52. Resuming the reading. According to Houston, a general shift in thinking at the agency occurred between 1968 and 1972 as to the desirability of maintaining a substantial airlift capability. The records appear to indicate that Houston convinced the director in the early 1970s that such a capacity was no longer necessary to retain. Houston commented on this assessment as follows: through what knowledge I had of the utilization of the various assets, it seemed to me that utilization, particularly of large assets, that is, heavy flight equipment, was going down to the point where there was very little of it. Consequently, we couldn't forecast a specific requirement. Such requirements as you could forecast were highly contingent, but I also remember a couple of times putting the caveat into the director that with a changing world and with the complications in the aviation field, once you liquidate it, you could not rebuild. So you ought to think very, very carefully before getting rid of an asset that did have a contingent capability. Footnote 51. Reading footnote 51. IBID page 57. Resuming the reading. Allegation of drug trafficking. Persistent questions have been raised whether agency policy has included using proprietaries to engage in illegal activities or to make profits which could be used to fund operations. Most notably, these charges included allegations that the CIA used air proprietaries to engage in drug trafficking. The committee investigated this area to determine whether there is any evidence to substantiate these charges. On the basis of examination, the committee has concluded that the CIA air proprietaries did not participate in illicit drug trafficking. As allegations of illegal drug trafficking by Air America personnel grew in the spring and summer of 1972, the CIA launched a full-scale inquiry. The Inspector General interviewed a score of officers at CIA headquarters who had served in Asia and were familiar with the problems related to drug trafficking. After this initial step, the Office of the Inspector General dispatched investigators to the field. From August 24 to September 10, 1972, this group traveled the Far East. End of page 229, beginning page 230. In search of the facts, they first visited Hong Kong, then 11 agency facilities in Southeast Asia. During this period, they interviewed more than 100 representatives of the CIA, the Department of State, the Agency for International Development, the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, the U.S. Customs Service, the Army, Air America, and a cooperating air transport company. This inspection culminated in an Inspector General's report in September 1972, which concluded that there was no evidence that the agency or any senior officer of the agency has ever sanctioned or supported drug trafficking as a matter of policy. Also, we found not the slightest suspicion, much less evidence, that any agency officer, staff, or contract has ever been involved in the drug business. With respect to Air America, we found that it has always, forbidden, as a matter of policy, the transportation of contraband goods aboard its aircraft. We believe that its Security Inspection Service, which is used by the cooperating air transport company as well, is now serving as an added deterrent to drug traffickers. Footnote 52. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 52. CIA Inspector General's report, quote, investigation of the drug situation in Southeast Asia, end quote. 9/72, page 2. Resuming the reading. But there were aspects of the situation in Southeast Asia which were cause for concern. The one area of our activities in Southeast Asia that gives us some concern has to do with the agents and local officials with whom we are in contact, who have been or may still be involved in one way or another in the drug business. We are not referring here to those agents who are run as penetrations of the narcotics industry or collection of intelligence on the industry, but rather to those with whom we are in touch in our other operations. What to do about these people is a particularly troublesome problem, in view of its implications for some of our operations, particularly in Laos. Footnote 53. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 53. IBID pages 2 through 3. Resuming the reading. The Inspector General noted that there was a need for better intelligence, not only to support American efforts to suppress drug traffic in Southeast Asia, but also to provide continuing assurance that agency personnel and facilities were not involved in the drug business. His report began by placing the allegations against the CIA in his historical perspective. It allowed that when the United States arrived in Southeast Asia, quote, opium was as much a part of the agricultural infrastructure of this area as was rice, one suitable for the hills, the other for the valleys, end quote. Footnote 54. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 54. IBID, page 5. Resuming the reading. The record before the Inspector General clearly established that official United States policy deplored the use of opium as a narcotic in Southeast Asia, but regarded it as a problem for local governments. It was equally clear that agency personnel in the area recognized its dangers to U.S. military operations and, quote, took steps to discourage. End of page 230, beginning page 231. Its use by indigenous paramilitary troops, end quote. Footnote 55. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 55. IBID, page 6. Resuming the reading. For example, MIO troops were ejected from various camps when they were caught using the drug, but the IG noted, we did not, however, attempt to prevent its use among the civilian population in those areas where we exercise military control, believing that such intervention would have been resisted by the tribals with whom we were working and might have even resulted in their refusal to cooperate. Footnote 56. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 56. IBID. Resuming the reading. Nor did the agency interfere with the movement of the opium from the hills to market in the cities farther south. In this regard, the IG remarked candidly, the war has clearly been our overriding priority in Southeast Asia, and all other issues have taken second place in the scheme of things. It would be foolish to deny this, and we see no reason to do so. Footnote 57. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 57. IBID. The report related a statement of a case officer which typified the CIA position in the matter during the period 1966 to 1968. The officer said that he, quote, was under the orders not to get too deeply involved in opium matters, since his primary mission was to get on with the war and not risk souring relations with his indigenous military counterparts by investigation of opium matters, end quote. Resuming the reading. Although it maintained this posture, the CIA was reporting information on opium trafficking long before any formal requirements were levied upon it. As far back as the mid-1960s, when CIA case officers began to get a picture of the opium traffic out of Burma as a byproduct of cross-border operations, they chronicled this information in their operational reporting. As more information came to light in Laos and Thailand, this information began to appear in intelligence reporting. Indeed, the agency, quote, had substantial assets, in brackets, in 2 Southeast Asian countries, which, end brackets, could be specifically directed against this target when it assumed top priority in 1971, end quote. Footnote 58. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 58. IBID, page 7. Resuming the reading. Air America. As early as 1957, Air America's regulations contained an injunction against smuggling. This regulation later came to include opium. The report indicated that the airline's effort at this time was concentrated on preventing the smuggling of opium out of Laos on its aircraft. Although still not a crime in Laos, shipment of opium on international flights was clearly illegal and was grounds for dismissal of any pilot or crew member involved. The Inspector General stated that Air America has had a few cases of this kind, all of which are documented in the files in the agency, and has, in each case, taken prompt and decisive action upon their discovery. Footnote 59. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 59. IBID. Resuming the reading. Air America was less able to control drug traffic involving its aircraft within Laos. Although it had a rule that opium could not be carried aboard its planes, the only thing that could be done, if the rule was violated, was to put the opium and its owner off at the nearest airstrip. End of page 231, beginning page 232. Moreover, as a charter carrier, Air America did not have full control over its traffic. It hauled what its customers put on the aircraft. Air operations officers, in the case of agency traffic, were responsible for authenticating the passengers and the cargo they wished to put on the plane. In some locations, the air operations officers had to rely on indigenous assistance for much of the actual details of preparing manifests, checking cargo, and supervising the loading of the aircraft. In areas where active military operations were in progress, this process could become cursory, if not chaotic. In such circumstances, the Inspector General concluded that it was hardly fair to blame Air America if opium happened to get aboard its aircraft. There is no question that it did on occasion. Footnote 60. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 60. IBID, page 8. Resuming the reading. With the realization that drug abuse among American troops in Vietnam was growing and that Southeast Asian heroin was finding its way to U.S. markets, the CIA's early attitude toward the opium problem began to change. The agency joined the effort that began in 1971 to halt the flow of opium and heroin from Burma, Laos, and Thailand, and pursued a vigorous intelligence program against these targets. In terms of staff and contract personnel, the Inspector General was impressed that, quote, "To a man, our officers overseas find the drug business as distasteful as those at headquarters," end quote. Footnote 61. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 61. IBID, page 11. Resuming the reading. Indeed, many of the CIA's officers were restive about having to deal with Laotian officials who were involved in the drug business. One young officer even let his zeal get the better of his judgment and destroyed a refinery in northwest Laos in 1971, before the anti-narcotics law was passed, thus risking being charged with destruction of private property. Footnote 62. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 62. IBID. Resuming the reading. But the IG reported CIA officers generally tolerated the opium problem, regarding it as just another of the frustrations one encounters in the area. From what the Inspector General contingent was able to observe in the field, quote, "The pilots in the employ of Air America and the cooperating air transport company merit a clean bill of health," end quote. Footnote 63. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 63. IBID, page 12. Resuming the reading. While it was true that narcotics had been found aboard some of their aircraft, in almost every case, the small quantity involved could only have been for the personal use of the possessor. The Inspector General felt that, given the strict anti-contraband regulations under which these two airlines have been operating for years, it is highly unlikely that any pilot would knowingly have permitted narcotics or any other contraband aboard his aircraft. Footnote 64. Reading footnote 64. IBID. Resuming the reading. Although they noted, quote, "If it is a truism to say that they're in the business for the money," end quote, the investigators concluded that these pilots, end of page 232, beginning page 233, were deeply committed to their job, and that the subject of drugs was as much an anathema to them as it is, quote, "to any decent, respectable citizen in the United States," end quote. Footnote 65. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 65. IBID. Resuming the reading. The Inspector General stated how one pilot felt about the subject. He stated, "You get me a contract to defoliate the poppy fields in Burma, and I'll take off right now and destroy them. I have a friend whose son is hooked on drugs, and I too have teenage children. It scares the hell out of me as much as it does you and the rest of the people in the States." Footnote 66. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 66. IBID, page 13. Resuming the reading. The report also established that the pilots were well paid, averaging close to $45,000 a year. Almost half of their salary was tax-free. In this context, the IG concluded that, although the temptation for big money offered by drug cannot be dismissed out of hand, it helps to know that the pilots are making good money. Further, an American living in Vientiane can bank a substantial part of his salary without much difficulty, and a common topic of conversation among pilots is how and where to invest their fairly substantial savings. Footnote 67. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 67. IBID. Resuming the reading. The milieu in which these pilots found themselves did serve to evoke images of them as mercenaries or soldiers of fortune. The Inspector Generals indicated that a, quote, number of them do like their wine and women, but on the job they are all business and very much like the average American, end quote. Footnote 68. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 68, IBID, page 14. Resuming the reading. The investigators, however, could not be as sanguine about the behavior of the numerous other individuals who worked for Air America and the cooperating air transport company as mechanics or baggage handlers. The nature of their work allowed these employees easy access to the airplanes and created real opportunities for concealing packages of narcotics in the airframes. The records indicated that there were several instances where employees had been fired because they were suspected of handling drugs. The Inspector General advised, despite the introduction of tighter security measures, it would be foolish to assume that there will not be any further attempts by mechanics and baggage handlers to conceal narcotics on airplanes. Footnote 69. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 69. IBID. Resuming the reading. In a startling revelation concerning indigenous officials in Southeast Asia, the IG bitterly reported that, in recent testimony to agency officers in Vientiane, Laotian officials who had been involved in the drug business stated that there was no need for drug traffickers to use Air America facilities because they had their own. We certainly found, end of page 233, beginning page 234, this to be true, in addition to the Royal Lao Air Force, RLAF. There are several commercial airlines in Laos, including Royal Airlines, Lao Air Development, Air Laos, and perhaps others, all of which evidently have ties with higher Laotian government officials. It is highly problematical whether these airlines have a full platter of legitimate business. Footnote 70. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 70. IBID. Resuming the reading. Another factor which had the effect of making Air America a less desirable target for the drug trafficker was that there were virtually no regular, prearranged flight schedules for the pilots. Ordinarily, the pilot did not know until he reported for duty which plane he would be flying or what his flight schedule would be for the day. Air America's Security Inspection Service, which was established in early 1972, also had 5 inspection units in Laos. Similar units were eventually established elsewhere in Southeast Asia. Each unit consisted of an American chief and 3 or 4 indigenous personnel. The baggage of the pilot and all the passengers traveling in CIA-owned aircraft was inspected in the presence of an American official before anyone was permitted to board. All cargo was inspected unless it had been exempted under established procedures. The very existence of the system was considered a deterrent to drug smuggling on Air America aircraft, and did result in several discoveries of drug smuggling among the baggage of passengers, although only 1 or 2 of these involved quantities of sufficient size to be as commercial. Agents and assets. This is one area where the CIA is particularly vulnerable to criticism. Relationships with indigenous assets and contacts are always broad. In Laos, clandestine relationships were maintained in every aspect of the agency's operational program, whether paramilitary, political action, or intelligence collection. These relationships include people who either were known to be or suspect of being involved in narcotics trafficking. Although these individuals were of considerable importance to the agency, it had doubts in some instances. For example, the investigators were troubled by a foreign official who was alleged to have been involved in one instance of transporting opium. He was evidently considered, quote, worth the damage that his exposure as an agency asset would bring. Although the station insists, A, that he is of value to the station as an agent of influence, in brackets, deleted, in brackets, and B, that his complicity in the deleted incident has never been proved, end quote. Footnote 71. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 71. IBID. Resuming the reading. Among liaison contacts, which in the military arena included virtually every high-ranking Laotian officer, the Inspector General warned that the agency was, quote, in a particular dilemma, end quote. The past involvement of many of these officers in drugs is well known, and the continued participation of many is suspected, yet their goodwill, if not actual cooperation, considerably facilitates the military activities of the agency supported irregulars. Footnote 72. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 72. IBID, page 18. End of page 234, beginning page 235. The Inspector General concluded that the fact remains that our continued support to these people can be construed by them, and by others who might become aware of the association, as evidence that the agency is not as concerned about the drug problem as other elements of the U.S. mission in Laos. The station has recently submitted at headquarters request an assessment of the possible adverse repercussions for the agency if its relationship to certain assets were exposed. We think that, on the whole, that assessment was unduly sanguine. We believe the station should take a new look at this problem, using somewhat more stringent criteria in assessing the cost-benefit ratio of these relationships. We realize that it is impossible to lay down any but the most general kind of rules in judging whether to continue or to initiate a clandestine relationship with Laotians. Each case has to be decided on its own merits, but within a framework that attaches appropriate importance to its possible effect on the U.S. government's anti-narcotics effort in Laos. It is possible that the station will need additional guidance from headquarters as to current priorities among our objectives in Laos. Footnote 73. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 73. IBID, page 19. Resuming the reading. 2. Non-operating proprietaries. Non-operating proprietaries vary in complexity according to their agency task. They are generally corporate shells in which facilitate foreign operations and clearly pose no competitive threat to legitimate businesses. The most elaborate are legally licensed and established to conduct bona fide business. All non-operating proprietaries do have nominee stockholders, directors, and officers, and are generally directed by one of the agency's proprietary management companies. The management address may be a post office box, a legitimate address provided by a cleared and witting company official or private individual, or the address of a proprietary management company. The non-operating proprietaries maintain bank accounts, generate business correspondence, keep books of account which can withstand commercial and tax audit, file state and federal tax returns, and perform normal business reporting to regulatory authorities. They are moderately capitalized, generally at around $5,000, and their net worth at any one time varies according to the agency task they are performing. As of December 31st, 1973, more than 60% of the combined net worth of these proprietaries was operating capital for companies which provide cover to agency personnel. Legally incorporated companies require less elaborate commercial administration due to the nature of the tasks they perform for the CIA. This kind of proprietary is directly managed by headquarters specialists operating in alias. No commercial book or accounts are kept, and in the event of a tax audit, the agency has to brief the auditing authority. Depending on use, administration may be as simple as maintaining bank accounts and filing annual franchise taxes, or as extensive. End of page 235, beginning page 236. As that required to obtain employee identification numbers, to pay personnel taxes, and to file tax returns. There are also sole proprietorships, which are proprietaries in the sense of being agency-owned and administered. The agency establishes and registers these sole proprietorships. Arrangements are made to provide an address for these entities, like the proprietary corporations administered by agency headquarters specialists in these companies provide cover, salaries, and tax attribution for agency personnel. Another type of entity used by the agency is a proprietary only in the sense of being agency-owned and administered. These are the notional companies which are not legally registered but have names and bank accounts controlled by the agency. The agency arranges domiciliary addresses, and any queries are referred to the agency specialists concerned. These notional entities are used to provide status and operational cover for agency personnel involved in all types of high-risk operations. C. Operation of proprietaries. 1. Statutory authority. The agency's statutory authority to spend money for proprietary corporations in support of agency operations is derived from Section 8B of the CIA Act of 1949. This act states, "The sums made available to the agency may be expended without regard to the provisions of law and regulations relating to the expenditure of government funds, and for objects of a confidential, extraordinary, or emergency nature. Such expenditures to be accounted for solely on the certificate of the director, and every such certificate shall be deemed a sufficient voucher for the amount therein certified." Footnote 74. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 74. 50 U.S.C. 403b. Resuming the reading. The language contained in Section 8b is adequate authority to exclude the operation of these proprietary corporations from the law governing government corporations in 31 U.S.C. 841 et seq. SCQ. However, the CIA General Counsel ruled in 1958 that the CIA should comply with the principles in that act to the extent possible, and this has been done. A classified memorandum of law by the CIA General Counsel on the agency's authority to acquire and dispose of a proprietary, without regard to provisions of the Federal Property and Administration Services Act, outlines the CIA's position. This position was upheld by the U.S. Direct Court in the Southern District of Florida in dismissing the suit Farmer versus Southern Air Transport on July 17, 1974. Footnote 75. That result was not appealed and remains the law. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 75. See page 246. Resuming the reading. 2. Specific controls. The formation and activities of proprietaries are controlled through various mechanisms to assure their proper use. These include internal, end of page 236, beginning page 237. Agency regulations, which establish the administrative procedures to be followed in the formation, operation, and liquidation of proprietaries. An administrative plan specifying the operational purpose, administrative and management procedures and costs, and a liquidation plan specifying details of liquidation and disposition of funds when liquidation is contemplated, must be coordinated among the affected CIA components and approved at appropriate management levels. This regulatory control, along with policy memoranda, are intended to assure proper conduct by proprietaries. Each agency component involved in the operation of a proprietary enterprise is responsible for compliance. The Chief of the Cover and Commercial Staff, the Director of Finance, and the Comptroller are assigned particular responsibilities. The controls and procedures applicable to each operating proprietary specify that a project outline and an administrative plan must be approved at the Deputy Director level. Routine control and administration is executed by a project officer at headquarters. The agency conducts semi-annual reviews to determine whether the operational needs still exist and performs regular audits to assure proper management and financial accountability. Proprietaries are liquidated as their usefulness ends, and new ones are performed as needed. 3. Treatment of profits. The CIA General Counsel ruled in January 1958 that, quote, income of proprietaries, including profits, need not be considered miscellaneous receipts to be covered into the Treasury, but may be used for proper corporate or company uses, end quote. Footnote 76. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 76. CIA General Counsel Memorandum of Law, January 6, 58. Resuming the reading. This subject was reviewed and the opinion reaffirmed by the General Counsel in July 1965. The policy of retaining profits has continued, although only a very few agency proprietaries have ever been profitable. The CIA's legal basis for retaining profits for the use of the operating corporate entities is discussed below. Section 104 of the Government Corporations Control Act provides that Congress shall enact legislation necessary to make funds or other financial resources available for expenditure and limits the use thereof as the Congress may determine. It is further provided that, quote, this section shall not be construed as preventing the government corporations from carrying out and financing their activities as authorized by existing law, end quote. Footnote 77. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 77. 31 U.S.C. 849. Resuming the reading. The legislative history explaining this section of the Act states that, quote, in cases where no other law required a congressional authorization of expenditures, the corporation, if it had means of financing other than annual appropriations, could continue to operate in the absence of any action by Congress on its budget program. End quote. Footnote 78. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 78. Senate Banking and Currency Committee Report 694. November 2nd, 45. Resuming the reading. The statute creating a particular government corporation may provide specifically how that corporation may use its profits in the conduct of its business. The Government Corporations Control Act clearly did not contemplate government operations of the type that the CIA has established. Furthermore, it is not feasible for agency proprietaries to be created by an act of Congress, or overseen precisely as provided for normal. End of page 237, beginning page 238. Government corporations in the Act. Nevertheless, the agency felt that the appropriate and reasonable policy would be to treat and control proprietaries in accordance with the terms of the law. The agency maintains that there is no need to have more restrictive rules applied to its corporations in the use of funds, including profits, than are applied to government corporations under existing statute. Thus, the agency considers the use by a proprietary of its earnings to carry on its corporate affairs without an offset against agency appropriations to be a legitimate practice which does not constitute an illegal augmentation of appropriations. With rare exception, operating proprietaries have not been self-sustaining from real income. Income, including profits, is retained by the proprietaries consistent with the usual operating practices of business enterprises. The use of proprietaries' profits is controlled by annual CIA reviews and audits of the total capital, investment, and profit situations in the context of operational objectives and cover needs of the corporations. The CIA maintains that, in effect, the annual project review is based upon an audit as searching as that required for statutory government corporations. While this may be technically true, such audits do not raise broad questions of program duration and effectiveness. There is no broad management audit in program terms, but rather only a financial audit to determine essential security and integrity. Moreover, there have been no outside audits of any kind, especially those to determine performance and effectiveness. One former CIA employee, intimately involved with this process, suggested strongly that these provisions were inadequate. This needs to be rectified, and the committee recommends that such audits be reported to the new Legislative Oversight Committee. Footnote 79. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 79. See Recommendation 50. Resuming the reading. 4. Disposition of funds. Any proprietary with funds in excess of its current or foreseeable needs is required to return such funds to the agency. Funds generated by the liquidation or termination of a proprietary are returned to the agency, except in a limited number of situations when they are transferred to another proprietary for, quote, similar use, end quote. On the basis of a CIA General Counsel opinion of February 3, 1975, the agency has revised its policy on the treatment of all returns of funds from proprietaries. All such returns are to be remitted to the United States Treasury as, quote, miscellaneous receipts, end quote. Prior to this change in policy, returns were treated as refunds of the previously recorded expenses up to the amount of such expense for a particular proprietary, with any excess amounts returned to the Treasury as, quote, miscellaneous receipts, end quote. Footnote 80. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 80. See Recommendation 52. Resuming the reading. D. The disposal of proprietaries. 1. Overview. The agency has emphasized the degree to which the extensive proprietary system it has maintained in the past has been disposed of in recent years. According to the current chief of the cover and commercial, end of page 238, beginning page 239, staff, at least as far as large proprietaries are concerned, quote, because of multitudinous reasons, they will be viewed as the solution of last resort. Footnote 81. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 81. Chief CCS, January 27, 76, pages 15 to 16. The Deputy Director of Operations noted recently in testimony, quote, I think by and large that the day of the big proprietary is over. We have attempted over the past few years to try to squeeze down on those kinds of proprietaries, and I think we have really gone now to a fairly small number and a fairly tightly controlled group of proprietaries who are doing legitimate operational jobs, particularly in the media field. Quote, our experience with proprietaries in the past has been, if left by themselves, they tend to absorb larger and larger amounts of government money and are not particularly for business. They are not very viable in the business sense and quickly become suspect as not having any commercial validity. And we have quickly become suspect as not having any commercial validity. And we have, I think, in the past 10 years, gotten rid of an enormous number of proprietaries in this field. I don't foresee us getting in the immediate future into any expansion of that proprietary record. I think we are about right in terms of where we are now, end quote. Resuming the reading. Size was a problem and made it, quote, inevitable that cover would not last, end quote. Moreover, there simply is not a need, according to the agency, for the kind of capabilities supplied by an Air America, either now or in the foreseeable future. In this regard, the agency has also indicated that no, quote, real proprietaries, end quote, are planning because there are no such operational requirements before the cover and commercial staff. The committee has learned from its study that the agency retains the capability, quote, in being, end quote, to create large proprietaries. Footnote 82. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 82. The DDO closed his recent testimony with a caveat, quote, I can visualize, however, depending on what happens to the agency in the future, the possibility that we might want to use more proprietaries, particularly in the field of cover, if this gets terribly tight or terribly difficult. But the average operational purpose, except for some of these media operations, all the average operational purpose, except for some of these media operations, all we need is cover, and I think that most of the proprietaries that we have fall into that category, end quote. Resuming the reading. Moreover, numerous, quote, shelf, unquote, corporations are kept available to provide cover. These entities are generally of the notional variety which do not compete with legitimate enterprises. Nevertheless, the agency has emphasized the need to maintain this general vehicle for at least one purpose: to retain assets. Notionals are a very effective mechanism when they are small and can be very effective in securely providing various support items. In addition, the chief of the cover and commercial staff told the committee that, in order to carry out operational functions, the CIA needs a variety of tools. We need a variety of mechanisms. We need a variety of cooperating personnel and organizations in the private sector. Proprietaries, in the largest sense, as we have used it throughout these investigations, are part of this arsenal of tools that the agency must have in order to fulfill its job. I said earlier on this morning that on the basis of our experience with proprietaries, we have come to the conclusion that wherever possible, we try to use other means of providing cover and hiding the CIA hand than proprietaries. But where there is no other way, or where it is the best way in order to achieve the operational objective, we have used proprietaries in the past, and we propose to continue to use proprietaries. So we are not getting out of the proprietary. End of page 239, beginning page 240. Business as such. But it is true that the proprietaries we are using at the present time, and what I can foresee for the immediate future, is going to be of smallish variety. Footnote 83. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 83. Chief CCS, January 27, 76. Page 19 through 20. So I'm going to stop here for this recording and pick back up in the next paragraph.